On a warm September morning in 1985, Marcus Johnson's life changed forever. The sun had barely risen over his auto repair shop in the quiet suburb of Springfield when two police cruisers pulled into the parking lot, their lights flashing but sirens silent. Marcus was underneath a Chevrolet Impala, fixing a transmission issue when he heard his assistant Tommy calling out to him. "Mr. Johnson, there are some officers here to see you." The concern in Tommy's voice made Marcus slide out from beneath the car faster than usual. As Marcus wiped his greasy hands on the red shop rag he always kept in his pocket, he saw four white police officers approaching him. Their hands rested on their holsters, and their faces showed no emotion. Marcus had always taught his children to be respectful to law enforcement, even though he knew the reality of being a black man in America. "Are you Marcus Johnson?" one officer asked, though it wasn't really a question. Before Marcus could finish saying, "Yes, sir," two officers had already moved behind him. "You're under arrest for the armed robbery of Preston's pharmacy that occurred on September 15th. The lead officer's voice was cold and mechanical. Marcus felt the cold metal of handcuffs clicking around his wrists. His mind raced. September 15th had been a Sunday, and he had been at church with his family, followed by their weekly dinner at his mother's house. Dozens of people could confirm this. "There must be some mistake," Marcus said calmly, though his heart was pounding. "I was at Mount Olive Baptist Church that morning, then at my mother's house. You can ask Reverend Williams or any of the congregation." The officers ignored his words as they read him his rights. Through the shop's large front windows, Marcus could see his regular customers and passersby stopping to stare. Tommy stood helplessly by the toolbox, his young face filled with confusion and fear. "Call my wife, Tommy," Marcus managed to say before they let him out. "Tell her to contact James Milton." James was a family friend and the only defense attorney Marcus knew. As the police escorted him to the cruiser, Marcus caught sight of Mrs. Henderson, the elderly white woman who had been bringing her car to him for 15 years. She was covering her mouth in shock. Next to her, Mr. Peterson, another longtime customer, was shaking his head in disbelief. At the police station, Marcus learned that the only evidence against him was a witness description that mentioned a tall black man in his 40s. The robbery had occurred at a pharmacy across town, a place Marcus had never even visited. The witness, a frightened elderly clerk, had admitted to only seeing the robber for a few seconds. In the interrogation room, Detective Sanders seemed uninterested in Marcus's alibi. When Marcus mentioned church and his mother's house, the detective simply wrote something in his notepad without looking up. "You know how many criminals claimed they were at church?" Detective Sanders finally said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Let me guess, you were singing in the choir too." Marcus thought about his three children, Michael who was 14, Lisa who was 12, and James who had just turned 9. He thought about his wife Sarah, who would be finishing her shift at the hospital soon, unaware that her husband was sitting in a police station being accused of a crime he didn't commit. The holding cell was cold and smelled of bleach and sweat. Marcus sat on the metal bench, still in his work uniform with Johnson's Auto Repair stitched above the pocket. Other detainees came and went, but Marcus remained, waiting for James Milton to arrive. Through the small window in his cell, Marcus could see the sky turning orange as evening approached. He thought about the 3 cars in his shop that were supposed to be finished today. He thought about his son Michael's football game that he was going to miss. He thought about how quickly a normal day had turned into a nightmare. When James Milton finally arrived, his face was grim. "Marcus, they're pushing this hard," he said after reviewing the preliminary reports. "Judge Whitfield has been assigned to your case, and he's—" James paused, choosing his words carefully. "He's not known for being fair to people who look like us." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold cell. Judge Robert Whitfield's reputation was well known in the black community. Some called him the Hammer for the harsh sentences he handed down to black defendants. As the first day of his nightmare drew to a close, Marcus Johnson sat in his cell, praying for strength. He didn't know then that this was just the beginning of a long journey that would destroy not only his life, but impact his family for generations to come. The county courthouse stood tall and imposing, its stone walls casting long shadows across the morning sidewalk. Marcus Johnson sat beside his attorney, James Milton, in courtroom 305. His wife Sarah had ironed his only suit the night before, but it still showed signs of age. much like the justice system they were about to face. Judge Robert Whitfield entered the courtroom, his black robe flowing behind him. The bailiffs' "all rise" echoed off the wooden panels, and Marcus noticed how some white attorneys nodded familiarly to the judge while James Milton's face remained carefully neutral. "Your Honor," James began, "the defense would like to." Judge Whitfield barely glanced at the papers. "Counsel, anyone can get their friends to sign papers. Do you have any real evidence?" From her seat behind Marcus, Sarah Johnson squeezed her hands together so tight her knuckles turned white. She watched as the judge repeatedly cut off their attorney while giving the prosecutor, Mr. Richards, unlimited time to speak. "The witness is absolutely certain it was a blackmail of Mr. Johnson's height and build," Richards announced to the court, though the original police report had noted the witness's uncertainty. When James tried to object, Judge Whitfield's gavel came down hard. "Overruled. Continue, Mr. Richards." During the lunch break, Marcus's mother brought the children to see him. 14-year-old Michael tried to act tough, but his trembling lower lip gave them away. Lisa, 12, couldn't stop crying, and 9-year-old James clung to his father's suit jacket. "Daddy, Mrs. Peterson came to our house," little James said. "She told Mama she saw you get arrested and knows you didn't do nothing wrong. She wants to tell the judge." Marcus looked at his attorney, hope rising in his chest. Mrs. Peterson was white, well-respected, and had known Marcus for years. James Milton nodded, understanding the significance. But when they returned to court and Milton called Mrs. Peterson to the stand, Judge Whitfield's prejudice showed itself again. "Your Honor, Mrs. Peterson can testify to Mr. Johnson's character and his whereabouts during other robberies in the area," Milton explained. "This court isn't interested in character witnesses who clearly have a business relationship with the defendant," Judge Whitfield declared, waving his hand dismissively. "Move on, counsel." Sarah watched as her husband's shoulders slumped slightly. She had never seen him look defeated before, not even when they lost their first house during the recession, or when his father passed away last year. The afternoon brought more injustice. When the prosecution presented their star witness, the elderly clerk who had only seen the robber for a few seconds, Judge Whitfield allowed her to change her story 3 times on the stand. But when James Milton tried to point out these inconsistencies, the judge threatened him with contempt of court. "Your Honor," Milton said, standing his ground, "I must object to the pattern off." The gavel crashed down. "One more word, Mr. Milton, and you'll be joining your client in custody." From the gallery, Marcus's mother let out a small sound of distress. She had lived through segregation and had seen the same scene play out countless times before. Different courtroom, different judge, same injustice. Late in the day, James Milton tried one last time to present evidence of Marcus's innocence. He had surveillance footage from a gas station near the church showing Marcus's car passing by at the time of worship service, directly contradicting the possibility of them being at the pharmacy. "Your Honor, this footage clearly shows." "Counsel," Judge Whitfield interrupted, his voice dripping with disdain, "this court has already ruled on admissible evidence. This last-minute attempt to introduce unverified video will not be permitted." As the court officers began clearing the room for the day, Marcus turned to look at his family. His children were huddled around their mother, fear visible in their young eyes. His mother sat straight-backed, her face a mask of dignity hiding decades of seeing justice denied to her people. James Milton gathered his papers, his movements controlled, but his anger visible in the tightness around his eyes. "Marcus," he whispered, "I'm going to file every appeal I can. Judge Whitfield's bias is clear as day. We just need one fair judge to see it." But as they watched Judge Whitfield leave the courtroom, chatting and laughing with the prosecutor, both men knew that finding fairness in this system would be an uphill battle. The judge's prejudice wasn't just about one case, it was about maintaining a system that had been stacked against black defendants for generations. The sun was setting as they left the courthouse, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward the county jail, where Marcus would spend another night, waiting for justice that seemed increasingly out of reach. The courtroom fell silent on sentencing day. Marcus Johnson stood straight, his dignity intact despite the orange jumpsuit that had replaced his worn suit. Behind him, his family filled the first 2 rows, each person holding on to faith, even as fear gripped their hearts. Sarah Johnson had dressed their children in their Sunday best, hoping to remind the judge that Marcus wasn't just a defendant, he was a father, a husband, a pillar of their community. 14-year-old Michael wore his father's old tie, while Lisa and young James sat quietly, their hands clasped in prayer. The court will now hear final statements before sentencing. James Milton rose, his voice steady despite the frustration of the past weeks. Your Honor, Mr. Johnson has no prior criminal record. He's a business owner who employs 3 people, a father of 3 children, and has been an upstanding member of this community for 20 years. The evidence against him is circumstantial at best. The judge's impatient drumming of fingers on his desk grew louder until Milton finally fell silent. The prosecutor stood next, straightening his expensive tie. Your Honor, this was a violent crime that terrorized an elderly victim. The community needs to see that such actions have serious consequences. Marcus noticed how Judge Whitfield nodded along with the prosecutor's words, his mind clearly made up long before this moment. Mr. Johnson, Judge Whitfield finally addressed Marcus directly. Do you have anything to say before I pass sentence? Marcus stepped forward, his chains rattling in the quiet courtroom. Yes, Your Honor. I stand before you an innocent man. I have worked honest days my entire life, taught my children to respect the law, and helped anyone who came to my shop, regardless of their race or ability to pay. I didn't commit this crime, and I ask for mercy not for myself, but for my family. Behind him, Sarah wiped tears from her eyes while trying to comfort their youngest son, who had started to whimper. Judge Whitfield's face remained stone cold. Mr. Johnson, this court has heard your claims of innocence, and the jury has found them wanting. Armed robbery is a serious offense that threatens the very fabric of our society. The judge paused, taking a long drink of water while the tension in the room grew unbearable. Furthermore, he continued, your continued denial of guilt shows a lack of remorse that this court cannot ignore. Therefore, in consideration of the violent nature of the crime and your failure to accept responsibility, Marcus's mother reached for Sarah's hand, both women bracing themselves. I hereby sentence you to 15 years in state prison. The gasps from the gallery were audible. Even the court reporter looked up in shock. For a first-time offender, with a crime where no one was physically harmed, 15 years was unprecedented. Your Honor, James Milton jumped to his feet. This sentence is grossly disproportionate. Just last week, in this very courtroom, you sentenced Mr. Peterson, a white defendant, to 3 years for an armed robbery with actual injury to the victim. Watch yourself, counsel, Judge Whitfield warned, his face reddening. One more word, and you'll be held in contempt. Young Michael Johnson stood up suddenly, his adolescent voice cracking with emotion. But my dad didn't do anything wrong. Remove that boy, Judge Whitfield ordered, pointing at Michael. Sarah pulled her son back down, wrapping her arms around him as he began to sob. Lisa stared straight ahead, tears streaming down her face, while little James buried his face in his grandmother's dress. Marcus turned to look at his family one last time before the officers approached to take him away. I love you, he mouthed to Sarah. Take care of them. As they led Marcus out, James Milton was already scribbling notes for an appeal. This isn't over, he promised Sarah. Judge Whitfield's bias is clear. We'll take this to every court in the land if we have to. The courtroom slowly emptied, but Marcus's family remained seated, too stunned to move. Sarah Johnson looked at her children, realizing that her youngest would be in high school by the time his father came home. Her daughter would become a woman without her father's guidance. Her eldest son would face the challenges of becoming a black man in America without his father's wisdom to protect him. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered around James Milton as he described the injustice they had just witnessed. But inside, in the now quiet courtroom, Judge Whitfield was already reviewing his next case, showing no sign that he had just destroyed a family's life. The afternoon sun streamed through the high windows, casting prison bar shadows across the floor, a fitting image for the years of separation that lay ahead for the Johnson family, all because of one judge's prejudice and a broken system that allowed it to flourish. The courtroom fell silent on sentencing day. Marcus Johnson stood straight, his dignity intact despite the orange jumpsuit that had replaced his worn suit. Behind him, his family filled the first 2 rows, each person holding on to faith even as fear gripped their hearts. Sarah Johnson had dressed their children in their Sunday best, hoping to remind the judge that Marcus wasn't just a defendant. He was a father, a husband, a pillar of their community. 14-year-old Michael wore his father's old tie, while Lisa and young James sat quietly, their hands clasped in prayer. James Milton rose, his voice steady despite the frustration of the past weeks. "Your Honor, Mr. Johnson has no prior criminal record. He's a business owner who employs 3 people, a father of 3 children, and has been an upstanding member of this community for 20 years. The evidence against him is circumstantial at best." The judge's impatient drumming of fingers on his desk grew louder until Milton finally fell silent. The prosecutor stood next, straightening his expensive tie. "Your Honor, this was a violent crime that terrorized an elderly victim. The community needs to see that such actions have serious consequences." Marcus noticed how Judge Whitfield nodded along with the prosecutor's words, his mind clearly made up long before this moment. "Mr. Johnson," Judge Whitfield finally addressed Marcus directly, "do you have anything to say before I pass sentence?" Marcus stepped forward, his chains rattling in the quiet courtroom. "Yes, Your Honor. I stand before you an innocent man. I have worked honest days my entire life, taught my children to respect the law, and helped anyone who came to my shop, regardless of their race or ability to pay. I didn't commit this crime, and I ask for mercy not for myself, but for my family." Behind him, Sarah wiped tears from her eyes while trying to comfort their youngest son, who had started to whimper. Judge Whitfield's face remained stone cold. "Mr. Johnson, this court has heard your claims of innocence, and the jury has found them wanting. Armed robbery is a serious offense that threatens the very fabric of our society." The judge paused, taking a long drink of water while the tension in the room grew unbearable. "Furthermore," he continued, "your continued denial of guilt shows a lack of remorse that this court cannot ignore. Therefore, in consideration of the violent nature of the crime and your failure to accept responsibility." Marcus's mother reached for Sarah's hand, both women bracing themselves. "I hereby sentence you to 15 years in state prison." The gasps from the gallery were audible. Even the court reporter looked up in shock. For a first-time offender, with a crime where no one was physically harmed, 15 years was unprecedented. "Your Honor," James Milton jumped to his feet, "this sentence is grossly disproportionate. Just last week, in this very courtroom, you sentenced Mr. Peterson, a white defendant, to 3 years for an armed robbery with actual injury to the victim." "Watch yourself, counsel," Judge Whitfield warned, his face reddening. "One more word, and you'll be held in contempt." Young Michael Johnson stood up suddenly, his adolescent voice cracking with emotion. "But my dad didn't do anything wrong." "Remove that boy," Judge Whitfield ordered, pointing at Michael. Sarah pulled her son back down, wrapping her arms around him as he began to sob. Lisa stared straight ahead, tears streaming down her face, while little James buried his face in his grandmother's dress. Marcus turned to look at his family one last time before the officers approached to take him away. "I love you," he mouthed to Sarah. "Take care of them." As they led Marcus out, James Milton was already scribbling notes for an appeal. "This isn't over," he promised Sarah. "Judge Whitfield's bias is clear. We'll take this to every court in the land if we have to." The courtroom slowly emptied, but Marcus's family remained seated, too stunned to move. Sarah Johnson looked at her children, realizing that her youngest would be in high school by the time his father came home. Her daughter would become a woman without her father's guidance. Her eldest son would face the challenges of becoming a black man in America without his father's wisdom to protect him. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered around James Milton as he described the injustice they had just witnessed. But inside, in the now quiet courtroom, Judge Whitfield was already reviewing his next case, showing no sign that he had just destroyed a family's life. The afternoon sun streamed through the high windows, casting prison bar shadows across the floor. A fitting image for the years of separation that lay ahead for the Johnson family, all because of one judge's prejudice and a broken system that allowed it to flourish. 6 months into Marcus Johnson's imprisonment, the fabric of his once tight family began showing signs of strain. Sarah Johnson sat at their kitchen table late one night, sorting through a pile of bills under the harsh fluorescent light. The auto shop, once their primary source of income, had lost half its customers since Marcus's arrest. The clock on the wall showed 11:30 p.m. Sarah had just finished her second shift at the hospital and would start her new morning job at the diner in 6 hours. Dark circles under her eyes told the story of endless working hours and sleepless nights. In the living room, 14-year-old Michael's school backpack sat unopened. His grades had dropped dramatically since his father's imprisonment, and today she had received another call from his principal. Michael had gotten into a fight after a classmate called his father a criminal. "Mom?" Lisa's voice startled Sarah. Her 12-year-old daughter stood in the doorway, still wearing her school clothes. "I can't sleep again." Sarah opened her arms, and Lisa crawled into them like she used to do when she was little. "I heard Tommy Martinez telling everyone at school that Daddy's in prison," Lisa whispered. "He said only bad people go to prison." Upstairs, 9-year-old James had taken to sleeping with his father's old work shirt. The smell of motor oil and his dad's aftershave was starting to fade, and Sarah didn't know how to tell him that soon even that small comfort would be gone. The prison visits were the hardest. Every other Sunday, Sarah would wake the children before dawn for the 3-hour drive to the state penitentiary. They'd wait in long lines, submit to humiliating searches, and finally get 45 minutes with Marcus in a room full of other families going through the same pain. During their last visit, Marcus had looked thinner, his usually bright eyes dulled by prison life. Michael had refused to meet his father's gaze, angry at the world and unsure where to direct that anger. Lisa had talked nonstop about school, trying to fill the heavy silence, while little James had just clung to his father until the guards announced time was up. The changes in their community were subtle but cutting. At church, people still smiled, but some pews emptied when the Johnsons sat down. Their longtime neighbors, the Wilsons, who used to bring over Christmas cookies every year, now crossed the street when they saw Sarah coming. One evening, while Sarah was working her hospital shift, Marcus's mother came to watch the kids. She found Michael sitting on the front porch, staring at his father's empty parking spot. "Your daddy was arrested in this same town when he was your age," she told him quietly, "for nothing more than walking home after dark. Some things haven't changed as much as people like to think." The children struggled in different ways. Lisa had become the perfect student, as if academic excellence could somehow make up for their family's shame. James had started wetting his bed again, and the school counselor suggested therapy they couldn't afford. Michael's anger grew with each passing month, along with his resemblance to his father. Sarah kept every letter Marcus wrote, reading them to the children at bedtime. His words remained strong and loving, never showing the despair she knew he must feel. "Keep your heads up," he'd write. "The truth will come out someday. Until then, we have to be strong for each other." One night, after a particularly hard day when their electricity had been cut off due to unpaid bills, Sarah found all 3 children sleeping in Marcus's old recliner. Michael had his arms around his siblings, protecting them even in sleep. On the floor lay a photo album, open to their last family vacation. Marcus teaching James to fish, Lisa braiding her father's hair on the beach, Michael proudly displaying a fish almost as big as himself. The phone rang, making Sarah jump. It was James Milton, their attorney, calling well after office hours. "Sarah, I found something," he said, his voice urgent. "The clerk from the pharmacy. She's having doubts about her identification. Says the police pressured her to be more certain than she was." Sarah gripped the phone tighter, hope and fear battling in her chest. She looked at her sleeping children, wanting to wake them with the news but knowing how many times hope had disappointed them before. Outside, a police siren wailed in the distance, and Sarah watched her children stir uneasily in their sleep. Even in dreams, they couldn't escape the reality of their father's absence. The night stretched ahead, full of uncertainty, as another day approached in their new normal, a family torn apart by injustice, holding on to each other and the dream of their father's return. 2 years into Marcus Johnson's sentence, on a rainy Tuesday morning, a man named Ray Thompson walked into Preston's pharmacy with a gun. The same pharmacy Marcus had allegedly robbed. But this time, everything went wrong. The security cameras captured it all. Thompson's face clearly visible as he demanded money from the register. When police arrested him an hour later, they found not only evidence from this robbery but items from several others, including a unique gold watch that had been stolen during the robbery Marcus was convicted of. Detective Sandra Martinez sat across from Thompson in the interrogation room, spreading photos from previous robberies across the table. "This watch," she said, pointing to the gold timepiece, was taken 2 years ago from Preston's pharmacy. Thompson laughed, a harsh sound in the small room. Yeah, that was my first big score. Old lady behind the counter was so scared she couldn't even look at me straight. Guess that's why they ended up pinning it on some other poor sucker. The detective's hand froze above her notepad. What do you mean, some other sucker? Read in the paper they got some black mechanic for that job. Johnson something. Man, I couldn't believe my luck. Cops stopped looking for me, and I kept right on working. Across town, James Milton burst into his office, startling his secretary. He had just received a call from a contact in the DA's office about Thompson's confession. His hands shook as he dialed Sarah Johnson's number at the hospital. Sarah had to sit down in the break room when she heard the news. Are you telling me they have proof? Her voice trembled with 2 years of suppressed hope. We have his confession on tape, Milton confirmed. The watch, Sarah. He still had the watch, and the security footage from today shows his build, his movements. It matches perfectly with the original robbery. But their hope soon met the brick wall of Judge Whitfield's resistance. When Milton filed an emergency motion for review, the judge took 2 weeks just to schedule a hearing. During those weeks, Marcus sat in his cell, trying not to let his mind run wild with possibilities. He stared at the photo of his family, Michael now 16 and angry at the world, Lisa 14 and trying to be strong, James 11 and struggling to remember his father's voice. The hearing day arrived with the same cruel formality as his original trial. Judge Whitfield sat on his bench, looking annoyed at having to revisit the case. Your Honor, Milton argued, we have not only a confession, but physical evidence linking another person to this crime. Mr. Johnson has served 2 years for a crime he demonstrably did not commit. Judge Whitfield peered over his glasses. Mr. Milton, the time for appeals has passed. This court cannot overturn a jury's verdict based on the words of another criminal. From her seat in the gallery, Sarah watched the color drain from Milton's face. But, Your Honor, we have the stolen watch, the security footage comparison. Enough. Whitfield's gavel cracked against the wood. This court will not be rushed into overturning a valid conviction. File your appeals through proper channels. As they left the courthouse, Milton grabbed Sarah's arm. This isn't right. Thompson's confession matches every detail of the original crime. The watch has the owner's engraving. Even the original witness has signed an affidavit saying she was pressured to identify Marcus. Sarah looked up at the courthouse steps, remembering how her children had stood there 2 years ago, watching their father being led away. How long, she asked. How long through proper channels? A year, maybe more, Milton admitted. But Sarah, this is it. This is what we've been waiting for. That evening, Sarah drove to the prison for her regular visit with Marcus. As she waited in the visiting room, she watched other families, mothers, wives, children, all caught in the same web of injustice. When Marcus appeared, she could hardly speak through her tears as she told him about Thompson's confession. Marcus listened quietly, his hands pressed against the glass between them. I knew the truth would come out someday, he said softly, but Sarah, promise me something. Promise me you'll tell the kids not to let the hate eat them up. Especially Michael. He's at that age where anger can turn a man cold. Outside the prison, the sun was setting behind gray walls topped with razor wire. Sarah sat in her car, holding the steering wheel tight, thinking about justice delayed and denied. In her purse was Thompson's confession, proof of her husband's innocence, and in her heart, the crushing knowledge that even truth might not be enough to overcome a judge's prejudice. The drive home felt longer than usual, as Sarah prepared herself to tell their children that while they now had proof of their father's innocence, they still couldn't bring him home. The Innocence Project office buzzed with activity as attorney Rachel Chen spread the Johnson case files across her desk. Photos, transcripts, and now Ray Thompson's confession covered every inch of space. Sarah Johnson sat across from her, clutching a fresh cup of coffee like a lifeline. Judge Whitfield's refusal to expedite the hearing isn't just unfair. It's a pattern, Rachel explained, pulling out a thick folder. We found 23 cases where he handed out drastically longer sentences to black defendants compared to white defendants for identical crimes. Sarah nodded tiredly. 3 months had passed since Thompson's confession, and Marcus was still behind bars. My son Michael hasn't smiled since his father went away, she said quietly. He'll be graduating high school next year, and his father might not be there. Rachel's team had partnered with the local civil rights coalition, building a case that went beyond Marcus's wrongful conviction. They were exposing decades of judicial misconduct by Judge Whitfield. Across town, James Milton stood before television cameras on the courthouse steps. Today, we're filing a comprehensive review of Judge Robert Whitfield's sentencing history, he announced. The data shows clear racial bias in his rulings, affecting hundreds of families in our community. The press conference attracted national attention. Civil rights leaders began arriving in town, organizing peaceful protests outside the courthouse. Every morning, demonstrators held signs reading "Free Marcus Johnson" and "Justice delayed is justice denied." Inside the prison, Marcus watched the news coverage on a small TV in the common area. Other inmates gathered around him, many sharing similar stories of facing Judge Whitfield's prejudice. "Man, that judge gave my cousin 15 years for something white boys get probation for," one inmate said, shaking his head. Sarah threw herself into the fight, speaking at community meetings and church gatherings. She watched her children find their voices, too. Lisa, now 14, wrote an essay about her father's case that won a statewide competition. Michael, despite his anger, started a student advocacy group at his high school. Little James, now 11, stood before his class during show and tell. "My daddy fixes cars," he said proudly. "He helps people even when they can't pay. But a bad judge put him in jail for something he didn't do, and now we're fighting to bring him home." The Innocence Project's investigation uncovered more disturbing patterns. Judge Whitfield had financial ties to private prisons. He belonged to social clubs that still quietly excluded black members. His public statements over the years revealed thinly veiled racist attitudes. One evening, as Sarah prepared dinner, Rachel Chen called with breakthrough news. "We found 3 other cases where Judge Whitfield refused to review new evidence that would have exonerated black defendants. The State Judicial Review Board has agreed to investigate." The investigation moved slowly, the pressure mounted. Local newspapers ran stories about Marcus's case. National civil rights organizations filed friend of the court briefs. Even some of Judge Whitfield's former colleagues began speaking out about his biased behavior. Marcus's mother, who had lived through segregation, sat in church every Sunday, praying for justice. "The arc of history bends slow," she told her grandchildren, "but it does bend toward justice." 6 months after Thompson's confession, the State Judicial Review Board announced a formal investigation into Judge Whitfield's conduct. The judge's face appeared on local news, his usual arrogance replaced by nervous defiance, as reporters questioned him about the mounting evidence of bias. Sarah kept a calendar in the kitchen, marking off days until the board's decision. Each evening, she would sit with her children, reading their father's letters and planning for his return. Michael had started working at another auto shop, learning the trade his father had mastered. Lisa was researching law schools, determined to fight for others like her father. The battle for justice was changing them all. Sarah saw it in Michael's newfound purpose, in Lisa's fierce determination, in young James' proud defense of his father. Their fight had become about more than just Marcus. It was about challenging a system that had allowed prejudice to wear a judge's robes. As autumn turned to winter, the Johnson family waited, hoped, and fought on. Their battle had become a movement, their pain transformed into purpose, their story a catalyst for change in a system that had failed them, but could not break them. Marcus Johnson noticed the pain in his side during his 4th year in prison. At first, he dismissed it as nothing serious, just another ache in a place that seemed designed to create them. But within weeks, the pain became his constant companion, sharp and insistent. The prison medical ward was understaffed and overwhelmed. "Take some aspirin," the nurse told him during his first visit. "Probably just pulled something in the yard." 2 months passed before he saw an actual doctor. Sarah knew something was wrong during their weekly phone call. Marcus's usually strong voice sounded strained, and he couldn't hide his wheezing. "It's nothing, baby," he insisted. "Just a little under the weather." But mothers know their children, and Marcus's mother recognized the same symptoms that had taken her husband. Marcus's father, years ago. During their next visit, she saw how her son had lost weight, how he winced when he moved, how his skin had taken on a grayish tone. The prison doctor finally ordered tests, but the earliest appointment was 3 months away. Sarah and James Milton fought the system, filing emergency medical appeals, but bureaucracy moved slower than disease. By the time Marcus received his diagnosis, stage 4 pancreatic cancer, the tumor had spread. The oncologist who reviewed his case estimated that earlier detection might have given him a fighting chance. If he'd been diagnosed when he first reported symptoms, the doctor told Sarah, the outcome might have been different. The irony was brutal. Just as the State Judicial Review Board was closing in on Judge Whitfield's misconduct, Marcus's body was failing him. The cancer moved quickly, as if making up for lost time. Michael, now 18, took to driving to the prison every weekend, spending hours sitting with his father. They talked about cars, about life, about the anger Michael had carried for so long. "I'm proud of you, son," Marcus told him during one visit. "Don't let what happened to me define your life." Lisa, 16 now, brought her homework to the prison hospital wing, reading her essays to her father as he lay in the narrow bed. She had written about justice, about family, about love that survives steel bars and stone walls. Marcus smiled through his pain, recognizing in his daughter's words the strength that had kept their family together. Little James, 13, and not so little anymore, struggled to reconcile the strong father in his memories with the thin, tired man in the hospital bed. But he still crawled up beside Marcus when the nurses weren't looking, telling him about school, about the car he would help him fix when he came home. Sarah split her time between work, caring for the children, and fighting for both her husband's freedom and his life. The Innocence Project lawyers had finally managed to get a new hearing scheduled, but Marcus's declining health turned it into a race against time. One cold morning, Rachel Chen rushed into the prison hospital with news. The Judicial Review Board found evidence of systemic bias, recommending all of Judge Whitfield's cases be reviewed. "Marcus, you could be home within weeks." Marcus smiled weakly from his bed. "Always knew the truth would come out," he whispered. But the truth came too late. 3 days before his scheduled release hearing, Marcus Johnson slipped away in the night. Sarah was holding his hand, their children asleep in chairs around his bed, when his breathing finally stilled. The funeral was held at Mount Olive Baptist Church, where Marcus had been that Sunday morning years ago when he was accused of a crime he didn't commit. The same congregation that had tried to testify to his character at the trial now filled the pews, mourning not just a man, but the justice that had come too late. Judge Whitfield was suspended the same week Marcus was buried. The news barely registered with the Johnson family as they laid their loved one to rest. Sarah watched her children place flowers on their father's grave. Michael standing tall in his father's old suit, Lisa holding her mother's hand, James wearing the tie his father had promised to teach him to knot. The certificate exonerating Marcus Johnson arrived 2 weeks after his funeral. Sarah placed it in a frame next to his photo, a bitter testament to justice delayed until it became justice denied. The document cleared his name, but it couldn't bring back the years stolen from him, couldn't heal the wounds left by a system that had failed him in every possible way. 1 year after Marcus Johnson's death, Michael stood at the podium in the state capitol building. At 19, he looked so much like his father that some of the older legislators did a double take. The crowd fell silent as he began to speak. "My father died an innocent man in prison," Michael's voice carried through the chamber. "But today, we're here to make sure his story helps change the system that killed him." The Johnson Justice Reform Act lay before the state legislature. Sarah sat in the front row, flanked by Lisa and James, watching her eldest son fight for the change his father's death had sparked. The bill proposed sweeping reforms: mandatory review of cases where new evidence emerged, stricter oversight of judicial conduct, and improved medical care for inmates. But more importantly, it required all judges' sentencing records to be reviewed annually for racial disparities. Behind the scenes, Rachel Chen and the Innocence Project team had worked tirelessly. They had uncovered 342 cases where Judge Whitfield's racial bias had resulted in disproportionate sentences. Each case represented a family torn apart, a life altered, a justice denied. Lisa, now 17, had started a youth advocacy group that spread across the state. They called themselves Marcus's Kids, and their social media campaign had helped bring national attention to judicial reform. She stood at rallies, telling their family's story, her voice growing stronger with each retelling. James, 14 now, had his father's gentle spirit and his mother's determination. He spent weekends helping at free legal clinics where families of incarcerated individuals could get help reviewing their cases. My daddy always said to help others. He would explain simply. Sarah had transformed her grief into purpose. She traveled the country, speaking about their experience, meeting with lawmakers and activists. The woman who had once worked 2 jobs to keep her family afloat now commanded attention in congressional hearings. Judge Whitfield's review had revealed decades of systematic discrimination. Hundreds of cases were being reopened. Some of Marcus's former prison mates were being released, their sentences vacated under the weight of evidence showing judicial misconduct. The day the Johnson Justice Reform Act passed, Sarah stood with her children on the Capitol steps. Reporters asked how she felt about her husband's legacy. Marcus always believed in justice, she said, her voice steady. He taught our children to fight for what's right, even when the system fights back. The changes came slowly but surely. A new conviction integrity unit was established, staffed by former defense attorneys and civil rights lawyers. They prioritized cases where evidence of judicial bias existed, working to right decades of wrongs. Michael took over at his father's old auto shop, reopening it with help from the community. He hired former inmates who had been wrongly convicted, giving them a chance to rebuild their lives. The shop became more than a business. It was a symbol of resurrection and redemption. Lisa graduated high school early and started college, majoring in law with a focus on criminal justice reform. Her application essay about her father had earned her a full scholarship. My father's story will help me protect other families, she wrote. James, though younger, found his own way to honor his father's memory. He started a mentoring program for children of incarcerated parents, creating the support system he wished he'd had during those difficult years. On the 5th anniversary of Marcus's death, the family gathered at Mount Olive Baptist Church for a memorial service. But this time, they weren't alone in their grief. The church was filled with families who had found justice through the reforms Marcus's case had sparked, their presence a testament to his lasting impact. Sarah stood before the congregation, her children beside her, and looked up at the faces of hope that had grown from their pain. Marcus used to say that the truth would come out someday, she told them. He didn't live to see it, but his truth changed the system that took him from us. The legacy of Marcus Johnson lived on in every case reviewed, every sentence reconsidered, every family reunited. His name became synonymous with the fight for judicial reform, his story a powerful reminder that justice, though sometimes delayed, could still transform the future. As Sarah watched her children continue their father's fight for justice, she knew that Marcus's spirit lived on in every life they touched, every wrong they helped right, and every step they took toward a fairer system for all.